Hey YouTube, this is Brian here. I'm going to be doing a top 10 countdown of my favorite wrestlers in no particular order, primarily focusing on North American wrestlers from the SmackDown era to now. Let's get to it. Number one on my list is Y2J Chris Jericho. He's one of those guys who really uh, makes it to the top shelf in terms of expectations, in terms of being a technical wrestler who's up there with the best, and a talker who's up there with the best, up there with Bret Hart and Mitsuharu Misawa on one side, and up there with Raven and Stone Cold Steve Austin on the other. There's very few guys who are really that great on both ends, and his debut in WWE in the late 90s was so memorable. It's probably one of the defining moments of the Attitude Era, which you really couldn't have had without Chris Jericho. And his return in 2008 after a long absence was pretty exciting too. I remember flipping out over that as a kid when I watched it. And he even made a good tag team with Big Show. Who else could have made a bald 40-year-old overweight diabetic Big Show entertaining? I don't think too many guys could have. Next up on my list is Shawn Michaels, a guy who's been also a very great talker for a long time and as defining to his eras as Jericho was to the ones that he was in. He made DX what it was. I think it was really Shawn Michaels more than it was Triple H. Um, and though he was gone for a few years after he had that traumatic injury I think he received from Goldberg, um, he's been a part of a lot of memorable moments, whether it was with Bret Hart, where he screwed Bret Hart over, the Montreal screw job, and it's his memorable finisher too is also part of it. It involves the crowd, and I think that's part of why he got over so much. Was because he had one of the best finishers in wrestling history. The crowd always counted down with him, and it seemed like both sides did, whether they were for him or against him. And you would have thought that would have broken kayfabe and let the guy who was about to get kicked in the face know that he was about to get knocked out. But somehow we all overlooked it, uh, kind of overlooked it, and we continued on as fans. It's just one of those things, kind of like the Undertaker and the Dead Man gimmick. Those crazy wrestling things, and Doink the Clown. Um, Next up on my list is going to be RVD, probably the face of ECW, which is my personal favorite wrestling company. He innovated American wrestling in so many ways by raising the bar of athleticism and by incorporating weapons into his moves, probably more than anybody had up to that point. He formed a great tag team with Sabu, and he was also a fantastic singles wrestler. He never really got the push he deserved, and maybe that was due to the fact that he wasn't a huge talker, I don't think. But he was a great, great athlete, and he had so many classic matches over the years, like his tag match where he teamed up with Sabu against Jinsei Shinzaki and Hayabusa, I think. That was unforgettable. Next up on my match is number 4, who's Rey Mysterio, and he was part of the first match I ever saw back in '06, I think it was. And I think he slowed down over the years, probably due to the normal wear of Lucha Libre. But he was one of the most exciting guys in WCW, and he brought that style not only to WWE but to American wrestling in general. I think he helped popularize that prevalent style of everybody doing Hurricane Ranas and head scissors and so on. Springboard moves became a lot more common after Rey Mysterio. I think he raised the bar of athleticism also. Uh, Next up is a man who was a technical legend, probably the best technical wrestler of all time, Eddie Guerrero. He was the first guy I ever heard of. Sadly, by his death in 2005, I heard of him Um, and I looked into his legend and his archive and his wrestling, and not only did he have a fantastic frog splash, but he cut really funny and really memorable promos. Like Jericho, he was one of those guys who could get over on the mic and in the ring. I remember watching his career retrospective DVD recently, and it spanned from when he had a mullet and it was still all greasy and stuff to when he had the blonde highlights and the spiked hair and was on SmackDown and won the title and everything. It's a shame he died when he was so young. He was so fantastic in the ring. I think he carried the show, even though he was in the mid card for a long time and his title reign was way too short. I think he carried the show for a long time, especially SmackDown. Next up is a man of many faces, and he could also get those faces over better than a lot of wrestlers in his shoes could have. He was almost like a backyard wrestler on the TV. Uh, he upped the violence we expected, and he really martyred himself for the fans. And we should all stand and applaud the living legend that is Mick Foley, or Mankind, or Cactus Jack, or Dude Love. He's worn many different suits, but I think Mick Foley pulled them off uh, in ways that no other person could have. You know, going through the flaming table or getting thrown off the cell, going through barbed wire, and he had that match, I think, with Edge at WrestleMania later on in his career. And he hadn't lost a step, and we all remember him, of course, getting pedigreed by Triple H into the thumbtacks. He had so many classic moments. That's without even going back into his more insane stuff in Japan, where he was a hardcore legend. Next up in my list is Jeff Hardy. I think the Hardy Boys really gave the identity to what the ladder match is today. Whether it's the TLCs or the Money in the Bank matches now. I think whenever anybody Googles those matches, they're really looking for Hardy Boys spots, whether it's those high swantons or somebody getting thrown through a table. I think they really gave their bodies to those matches with all those extreme leaps, and they also gave the identity to what became the earlier TLC matches. Um, Best TLC matches are typically the ones that have the Hardys and Edge and Christian and the Dudleys and and they feature Triple H or those other guys. You just know who's gonna win already, and it gets so boring early on. Next up is a guy who was great as a tag team wrestler in those aforementioned TLC matches. Edge, when he was part of Edge and Christian. Early on in his run, he had that weird gimmick with the Brood as a vampire, but he was able to kind of pull through that and join with Christian as a memorable tag team, and he's become a Hall of Famer. I think he got injured and he's now out, but very few guys could have had a successful singles career. He had that memorable feud with Matt Hardy and with John Cena. Very few guys could have had that legendary singles career and tag team career. I think, look at the Eliminators or the Dudleys. No one remembers a Devon Dudley classic where he headlined WrestleMania, or when Brother Ray or whatever from TNA. Uh, Nobody can really stand where Edge was in terms of pulling it off on his own and working well with another guy without being a narcissistic douchebag. Uh, Next up is Sabu, arguably RVD's well, his tag partner and his only other competition for face of ECW with the Arabian Facebuster, and he really explains his wrestling style by the scars he bears on his body, and like Foley, he's martyred himself for the audience, and few guys I think up the level of violence and expectation for weapon integration in matches more than Sabu. Maybe Abdullah the Butcher and Mick Foley, Terry Funk. I don't know, but I think Sabu kind of raised the bar in a very creative way with the high jumps that involve chairs still. The final entrant on my list is CM Punk. Now, I know he wasn't in WWE for very long, but I'm also picking him for his matches on the Indies, where he was also excellent. Um, but he was great cutting his promos uh, up to when he left WWE and retired from wrestling. It kind of reminds me of Jericho leaving for Fozzy when CM Punk left for the UFC. It's just what? It's like you have all this and you're leaving to basically do nothing and do nothing, you know. But I think he got me into indie wrestling, and this was before that whole NXT scene. This was when there was WWE ECW. So when they were just bringing up a couple young guys, there was some underdogs to root for, some dudes who actually had some athleticism, and he really introduced me to promotions like ROH. Um, that I wouldn't have otherwise known about. I think by going back and checking out where he'd been earlier, you know, you follow the tracks of greatness. And he was a great talker. He was up there with guys like Raven. Well, really, that's the end of my list. I'm going to cut it here. Thanks for watching.